In the 1830s, a machine was invented that could do the work of 50 men in a single afternoon. It was faster, cheaper, and more reliable than any crew. It should have spread overnight. Instead, towns banned it. Workers destroyed it. Some states made it illegal to operate within city limits, not because it was dangerous, not because it didn't work, because it worked too well. And the men it replaced had nowhere else to go. This is a story about what happens when progress arrives before the people it displaces are ready. And it starts not with the machine itself, but with the labor it was built to destroy. If you had walked onto a Virginia wheat farm in 1825, you would have seen something that hadn't changed in 1,000 years. Harvest. Men standing shoulder to shoulder in fields that stretched to the tree line, on each one gripping a hand scythe, a curved blade about 2 feet long attached to a wooden handle worn smooth by years of sweat. They worked in rows. One man would grab a fistful of wheat stalks with his left hand, swing the scythe low with his right, and cut the stalks clean at the base. Behind him, another man would gather the fallen wheat into bundles, tie them with a twist of straw, and stack them upright to dry. Behind that man, a boy, usually a son or a nephew, would follow with a rake, pulling the loose heads of grain from the stubble. A good team of 5 men could harvest about 2 acres a day. 2 acres. In a region where a single farm might stretch across 200, that meant harvest season lasted weeks, sometimes more than a month, and every day was a race against the weather. A late rain could flatten the crop. An early frost could ruin the grain before it dried, and so every available hand in the county was pulled into the fields. School teachers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers. If you had arms and a back, you worked the harvest. But the harvest was only half the battle. Once the grain was cut and bundled, it had to be threshed. And threshing was the real labor. Picture a barn in November. The doors are shut against the cold. Inside, the air is thick with dust, so thick you can taste it on your tongue, feel it grit between your teeth. The light comes in through the cracks in the planks, thin golden lines cutting through the haze. On the floor, a layer of wheat stalks has been spread out, and 2 or 3 men stand over it with flails. A flail is a simple tool. A long wooden handle with a shorter stick attached by a leather strap. You raise it over your head and bring it down on the stalks, again and again, beating the grain loose from the husks. The rhythm of it fills the barn. Thwack, thwack, thwack. Hour after hour. Your shoulders burn. Your hands crack and bleed. The dust fills your lungs until you cough up brown spit at the end of the day. A strong man could thresh about 7 bushels of wheat in a day. 7 bushels. A typical farm produced somewhere between 500 and 1,000 bushels per season. You do the math. Threshing wasn't a job that lasted a week. It lasted the entire winter. And for the laborers who did it, that winter work was everything. It was the only guaranteed income between the end of harvest and the beginning of spring planting. Without threshing, a farm laborer had nothing. No work, no wages. No way to feed his family until the ground thawed. This is the world the machine entered, and this is why the machine was feared. The first practical threshing machine was built in Scotland in 1788 by a man named Andrew Meikle. It was a box about the size of a small wagon with a rotating drum inside fitted with iron beaters. You fed the wheat stalks into one end, the drum spun, the beaters knocked the grain free, and the straw came out the other side. It was powered by a horse walking in a circle, turning a gear connected to the drum by a belt. The whole operation required 2 men to feed it and 1 boy to lead the horse. 3 people. And in a single afternoon, those 3 people could thresh what had taken a dozen men an entire week to do by hand. By the 1830s, improved versions of Meikle's machine had crossed the Atlantic. American manufacturers in Pennsylvania and Ohio were building their own models, some powered by horses, some by water wheels, and a few, the newer ones, by small steam engines. The machines were getting cheaper. A farmer who had spent $200 on winter labor could now buy a threshing machine for about the same price and use it for years. The economics were obvious, the human cost was equally obvious, and nobody who would be affected by it had any say in the matter. Around the same time, a young Virginian named Cyrus McCormick was working on a different problem. Not threshing, but cutting. In 1831, at his family's farm in the Shenandoah Valley, McCormick demonstrated a mechanical reaper. It was an ugly, rattling contraption pulled by two horses, shear with a vibrating blade that cut the standing grain and a reel that swept it onto a platform. It was loud, it scared the horses, and it could cut as much wheat in a day as 5 men with scythes. McCormick spent years refining his reaper. He patented it in 1834. But the real story isn't the invention. The real story is what happened when these machines, the threshing machine and the reaper, began to spread into communities that depended on manual labor for survival. If you're the kind of person who thinks about the human side of progress, you'll want to subscribe. We tell stories like this one every week. To understand the fear, you have to stop thinking about the machine and start thinking about the men, not as abstract workers in a history textbook, but as individuals. Men with names, with families, shine with debts at the general store, and children who needed shoes before winter. In rural England and in the American countryside of the 1830s and 1840s, the agricultural laborer occupied the lowest rung of the economic ladder. He owned no land. He owned no tools beyond what he could carry. His only asset was his body, his back, his arms, the hours of daylight he could fill with physical effort. And the value of that body was determined entirely by how much work was available. The yearly cycle of farm labor had a brutal simplicity to it. In spring, there was plowing and planting, a few weeks of intense work, then a lull. In summer, there was haying and some maintenance. Then came the harvest in late summer and early fall, the busiest time, when every hand was needed and wages were at their highest. And then winter, threshing season, like the long months of steady, reliable work that kept families alive until the cycle started again. When the threshing machine arrived, it didn't just take away a job. It took away the only job that mattered during the only season when no other work existed. A laborer who lost his threshing work didn't have the option of finding something else to do. There was nothing else. The factory system was still in its infancy in America. The cities were growing, but they were far away, and getting there required money that these men didn't have. The choice was simple and terrifying. Accept the machine and starve, or fight it. And so they fought it. In England, the resistance came first, and it came with a fury that shocked the ruling class. In the autumn of 1830, a wave of machine breaking swept across the English countryside. It started in the county of Kent and spread like fire through Hampshire, Wiltshire, Berkshire, and beyond. Agricultural laborers, many of them the same men who had spent their winters threshing by hand, moved from farm to farm under cover of darkness, dragging threshing machines into fields and smashing them with sledgehammers. They set haystacks on fire. They sent threatening letters to farmers and landlords, signed with a single name, Captain Swing. Nobody knew who Captain Swing was. He probably wasn't a real person. But the name carried weight. A letter would arrive at a farmhouse written in rough handwriting, warning the farmer that if his threshing machine was not destroyed by a certain date, his barn would burn. And the barns burned. Over the winter of 1830 and 1831, more than 100 threshing machines were destroyed across southern England. 19 counties were affected. Nearly 2,000 men were arrested. Over 250 were sentenced to death, though most of those sentences were eventually commuted to transportation, which meant exile to the penal colonies in Australia. 19 men were hanged. The Captain Swing riots were the largest rural uprising in English history since the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. And the government's response was absolute. They crushed it. Special commissions were set up to try the rioters. The message was clear: you may destroy the machine, but the machine will be replaced and you will be punished. In America, the resistance was less organized but no less real. It took different forms depending on the region and the machine in question. In the Northeast, where the textile industry was growing, hand weavers watched as power looms made their skills worthless almost overnight. Francis Cabot Lowell had built the first fully integrated textile mill in Waltham, Massachusetts in 1814, and by the 1830s, the Lowell mills along the Merrimack River were producing cloth at a speed and cost that no hand weaver could match. Some weavers petitioned their state legislatures for protection. Others simply left, moving west or taking whatever factory work they could find, which often meant operating the very machines that had displaced them. In the agricultural regions of the mid-Atlantic and the South, the resistance to threshing machines and reapers was more direct. There are scattered but documented accounts of machines being sabotaged, of parts being stolen in the night, of barns where machines were stored catching fire under circumstances that were never quite explained. In some Pennsylvania farming communities in the late 1830s, there was enough organized opposition to threshing machines that local politicians took notice. County meetings were held where laborers made their case. Their arguments were straightforward. They didn't claim the machine was bad. They acknowledged it was faster and cheaper. But they asked a question that nobody in a position of authority was prepared to answer. What are we supposed to do instead? The answer, when it came, was usually silence. This wasn't ignorance. It wasn't Luddism in the simplistic sense that word is often used today as a synonym for being afraid of technology. These were rational men making a rational calculation. The machine eliminated their income. There was no replacement income available. Therefore, the machine was a threat to their survival. You don't need a degree in economics to understand that. You just need to be hungry. If this is changing how you think about the relationship between technology and the people it displaces, subscribe. There's a lot more to this story. The legal resistance to labor-saving machinery in 19th century America is one of the least discussed chapters in the country's industrial history. And the reason it's least discussed is that it was, in the end, a losing fight. But for a period of years, in scattered towns and counties across the eastern United States, communities tried to use the law as a wall between their livelihoods and the machine. The most common form of legal restriction wasn't an outright ban on the machine itself. It was more subtle than that. Municipal ordinances targeted the power source rather than the device. Steam engines were the particular target. In the 1830s and 1840s, dozens of towns and cities passed ordinances restricting or outright prohibiting the operation of steam engines within their limits. The stated reason was almost always public safety. Steam boilers did explode. The fires they required did pose a risk to neighboring buildings. These were legitimate concerns. But if you read the transcripts of the town meetings where these ordinances were debated, you find something else layered beneath the safety arguments. You find working men standing up and saying plainly that the steam engine will take their jobs and asking their elected officials to protect them. In some cases, the protection was granted. Several towns in Pennsylvania and New York passed ordinances in the 1830s that effectively prevented steam-powered mills and threshing operations from setting up inside municipal boundaries. The language was careful. It referenced fire codes and public nuisance laws, but the effect was the same. If you wanted to run a threshing machine or a sawmill powered by steam, you had to do it outside town limits, away from the population centers where the labor force lived. This created an awkward geography of progress, where machines operated in the countryside while towns tried to hold them at the gate. Some restrictions went further. There are records of county-level petitions in Maryland and Virginia in the 1830s and 1840s asking state legislatures to regulate the use of threshing machines during months when laborers were most dependent on hand-threshing work. The argument wasn't against the machine existing. It was against the machine operating during the winter months, when its competition with human labor was most devastating. These petitions generally failed. But the fact that they were filed tells you something about how seriously the threat was taken. The parallels to the Luddite movement in England are striking, but they're also instructive in their differences. The Luddites were textile workers in the Midlands who, between 1811 and 1816, organized a campaign of machine breaking directed specifically at the stocking frames and shearing frames that were destroying their trade. The name came from Ned Ludd, a possibly fictional figure said to have smashed 2 stocking frames in a fit of rage. The Luddites weren't opposed to technology in general. They were skilled artisans who saw their particular skills being made worthless by machines that could be operated by unskilled workers at a fraction of the cost. The British government's response was ferocious. In 1812, Parliament passed the Frame Breaking Act, which made the destruction of industrial machinery a capital offense. Soldiers were deployed to the manufacturing districts. At the York Assizes in January 1813, 17 Luddites were sentenced to death. Some were hanged, others were transported to Australia. The movement was broken by force. In America, the resistance never reached that level of organization or that level of government reprisal, in part because the American economy was different. There was more land. There was more room to move. A displaced English weaver in 1812 had few options. A displaced American laborer in 1835 could, in theory, move west. But in theory and in practice are very different things when you're a man with a family, no savings, and no way to get to Ohio. What the American and English experiences shared was a fundamental truth that neither government was willing to confront. The machine wasn't the problem. The problem was that there was no system in place to catch the people who fell when the machine pushed them off the ledge. No retraining, no compensation, no transition period. The machine arrived, the jobs vanished, and the men who held those jobs were left to figure it out on their own. Some did, many didn't. In England, the aftermath of the Captain Swing riots and the Luddite suppression fed directly into the Chartist movement and the broader push for workers' rights that would define British politics for the next century. In America, the displaced agricultural workers became part of the Great Westward Migration, the flood of landless men and their families pushing into Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, and beyond. They didn't stop being workers. They just became workers somewhere else, doing something else, and the machines they had feared followed them west. Here is the part of the story that defenders of progress prefer to tell, and they're not entirely wrong to tell it. The machine won. It always wins. The question was never whether the threshing machine or the reaper or the power loom would prevail. The question was how long the fight would last, and how many people would be ground up in the gears during the transition. By the 1850s, resistance to agricultural machinery in America had largely collapsed. The economics were simply too compelling. A farmer who adopted the McCormick reaper could harvest his wheat crop in days instead of weeks. A farmer who bought a threshing machine could process his grain over a long weekend instead of spending the entire winter at it. The savings in labor costs alone paid for the machine within a year or two. And as more farmers adopted the machines, the farmers who held out found themselves at a competitive disadvantage. They couldn't sell their wheat as cheaply. They couldn't bring it to market as quickly. The invisible hand of the market was pushing the machine into every barn and every field, and no amount of sabotage or petitioning could push it back out. The Civil War accelerated this process dramatically. When hundreds of thousands of young men left the farms of the North to fight, the labor shortage became acute. The women and older men left behind couldn't harvest the wheat by hand. They needed the machines. McCormick's factory in Chicago, which had been producing around 1,000 reapers a year in the late 1850s, ramped up production to meet the demand. By 1864, the factory was turning out more than 6,000 reapers a year. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton is reported to have said that without McCormick's reaper, the Union could not have fed its army and fought the war at the same time. The machine that had been feared and resisted became, in the space of a few years, essential. After the war, there was no going back. The men who returned from the fighting came home to a landscape that had changed. Machines were everywhere. The threshing machine, the reaper, the horse-drawn hay rake, the mechanical corn planter. Each one replaced a task that had once required human hands. Each one eliminated jobs that would never return. And the men who had done those jobs found themselves in a world that had moved on without them. This is the pattern. It has repeated itself with such predictable regularity across the last 2 centuries that you could set a clock by it. A new machine is invented. It does the work of many people faster and cheaper. Workers resist. Communities try to ban or restrict it. The economics win. The machine spreads. The workers are displaced. And then, within a generation, everyone forgets there was ever a fight at all. The power loom displaced the hand weaver. The sewing machine displaced the seamstress. The combine harvester displaced the threshing crew. The automobile displaced the horse and every industry that supported it. The shipping container displaced the longshoreman. The automated assembly line displaced the factory hand. The ATM displaced the bank teller. The self-checkout kiosk displaced the cashier. And now, in our own time, artificial intelligence is beginning to displace the knowledge worker, the writer, the coder, the analyst, the customer service representative, the paralegal, the radiologist, on the people who thought they were safe because their work required a mind, not a muscle. The machine always wins, but the speed of the victory varies and the cost is never borne equally. The farmer who bought the McCormick Reaper in 1855 prospered. His children inherited a more productive farm. His grandchildren went to college on the profits. But the laborer who lost his harvesting job in 1855 didn't share in those profits. He moved west, or he moved to the city, or he simply grew old and poor in the same county where his family had lived for generations, watching the machines work the fields he used to work with his own hands. If you've stayed with this story this far, you understand something that a lot of people never think about. Progress has a price, and the people who pay it are almost never the people who profit from it. If that matters to you, subscribe. There's one more thing you need to understand about the machines that were banned in 19th century America, and it's the thing that connects this story to yours, wherever and whenever you're watching this. The workers who smashed the threshing machines weren't wrong. Not about the machine. Not about what it would do to them. They saw it clearly. They understood, with the kind of clarity that only comes from desperation, that the machine would take their winter work, that their families would go hungry, that no one in a position of power was going to help them. They were right about all of it. Every prediction the Captain Swing rioters made came true. The threshing machine did eliminate their jobs. Their families did suffer. The government did nothing to help them. Where they were wrong, the only place they were wrong was in believing that they could stop it. They couldn't. No one ever has. Not the Luddites in their English workshops, not the farmhands in their Pennsylvania barns, not the longshoremen on the New York docks in the 1950s, not the auto workers in Detroit in the 1980s. The machine always wins because the machine serves the interests of the people who own it. And the people who own it have the money and the political power to ensure that it spreads. But here is the thing that keeps me up at night, and maybe it will keep you up too. The threshing machine did spread. The hand flail disappeared from American agriculture within a generation. The men who had used it were forgotten, not in the abstract sense of